Good morning to our viewers in the United States and good afternoon to our viewers in Europe. I'm Wiebke Wartenberg, Senior Program Officer with the Aspen Institute Germany in Berlin, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion. Please make sure that your mics are off for this discussion and your videos on, as we want this to be an interactive discussion today. We are very pleased to welcome you to the 6th event in our German-American State Legislator Dialogue, a cooperation between the American Council on Germany and the Aspen Institute Germany. The series provides a platform for subnational exchange and in-depth discussions among German and US state legislators and a broader audience on common transatlantic challenges. Both of our organizations have recognized the increasing role of subnational actors such as states, communities, and cities in addressing the pressing issues of our time. And we believe it is critical to engage decision makers and opinion leaders at the state and local level. So we are delighted to have you with us today. And with that, let me hand over to Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, who will moderate today's discussion. Steve, the floor is yours.
Wiebke, herzlichen Dank. Many thanks. At the ACG, we are absolutely delighted to be partnering again with the Aspen Institute Germany. It is always wonderful to work together. And this is, I think, a very special project for us. The 5 conversations that we've had so far with state legislators have really underscored the importance of bringing together decision makers, opinion leaders at the state level to talk about issues of common concern on both sides of the Atlantic. And of course, today we'll be focusing on the topic of affordable housing and urban development. In recent years, I think it's fair to say, many cities in Germany and in the United States have experienced a dramatic increase in real estate values, and this has made it more difficult for lower income and even many middle income residents to find affordable housing. The rise in prices is caused by a range of issues, and those include not enough supply, but also really high demand in regions with strong labor markets. And so to help us explore how American states and how German Länder are helping their urban communities address these challenges and meet these challenges, we're joined by a really distinguished panel. From Germany, I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Anke Frieling. She's a representative in the Hamburg Parliament and represents the CDU. And from Berlin, Mathias Schulz, he's a representative in the Berlin House of Representatives and is a member of the SPD. So herzlich willkommen to Germany. We're delighted to have both of you with us. And here in the United States, we have with us Delegate Marvin Holmes from the Maryland House of Delegates. Delegate Holmes, thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So before we dive in, I have a couple of housekeeping points. The first is that our event today is using Zoom meeting rather than the webinar function. And we're doing this so that we can have a more interactive exchange. We hope that you'll keep your cameras on, but your mic muted so that we can see you, but not hear you until the time when you want to ask a question or weigh into the conversation. If you'd like to pose a question, please use the raise your hand function in Zoom and I'll call on you. You can then unmute your mic and participate in the conversation. But you can also use the chat function in Zoom to pose a question, and I'll do my best to fold your questions into the conversation. If you take the mic, given the limited amount of time that we have today, please don't make long statements. Try to keep your questions short and concise. And if they're addressed to one person in particular, please let us know who you're asking your question of. So with that, let me try to set the stage. Affordable housing and sustainable urban development have become critical issues for communities in both countries. And this is true especially when coupled with rising energy prices. A couple of statistics. In the United States, nationally, there's a shortage of more than 7 million affordable homes for the nearly 11 million low-income families who need housing. There is no state or county where a renter working full-time at a minimum wage job can afford a 2-bedroom apartment. And 70% of all extremely low-income families are severely cost-burdened, paying more than half of their income on rent. In Germany, the picture's a little bit different, but there are some similarities. Huge demand and limited supply have pushed up rents across the country, a country where renters, especially in cities, make up the dominant part of the population. In a 2018 snapshot, and this number is likely to be even higher now, a study showed that 4.4 million households in major urban areas in Germany were living in spaces that were either too small or too expensive. So that's just kind of an initial taste, but I want to bring in the experts now. I'd like to start maybe with each of the three of you by asking you to describe the current housing situation or housing challenge in your state and region. And Frau Frieling, perhaps we can start with you and get a sense of what things look like in Hamburg.
Yes, thank you very much. The situation in Hamburg is, it's said to be the best in Germany, but it's still not good because for the last 10, and the situation of Hamburg has changed over the last 25 years quite a bit. We, as a city, the city was not growing between the late 90s until 2010 or so. So we actually did we put a lot of effort as a city in kind of promoting our city and attracting people to Hamburg. So in that regard, the situation in terms of housing was not too bad and it wasn't very expensive. So that changed as of like 2010, 2011. It was also the time when the city decided to start building more, and we've had quite an ambitious program run by the SPD and by the joint government of Red and Green here in Hamburg ever since then. Started I think with a goal of 5,000 entities permits per year, and was risen after 5 years to 10,000 per year. Actually, these goals were met quite often. But of course, a building permit is not an apartment you can live in. So of course, there is a time lag, and that keeps growing. And in terms of affordable, and plus we also had a second condition, which is actually basically a very good one. That as soon as you build like 30 or 40 or bigger apartment blocks, you have to provide affordable housing. So usually you have 1/3 of apartments you're going to sell, 1/3 you rent out at normal prices, and 1/3 affordable. But of course, what happened when the project managers managed the cost of their buildings, they kind of used the 2/3 became more expensive because they subsidized the cheaper ones, although the cheaper ones were also very often subsidized, of course, by the government. But that's what happened. So in terms of affordable housing, Hamburg falls short, and every single year does more so. So we have quite a few people who actually were eligible to these kind of housing, but there is nothing. Of course, this situation has deteriorated with the situation in 2015 and is, as of now, even further deteriorating with more refugees coming to Hamburg after the war started in Ukraine. So I think that's the short version.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great overview and a great starting point for us. Maybe one quick follow-up, which is if Hamburg falls short in affordable housing, what do people do? I mean, how do they get by?
Well, I think that's a situation that's basically most people actually do live somewhere. So they just stay there. And as you said, as you mentioned in your introduction, of course, quite a few people pay more rent than they could afford. So you said no more than 30%, but I think here in Hamburg, you have quite a few people who pay more, close to 50%. And of course, for them, with the energy crisis is going to be a nightmare. Yeah. So we'll see how much the government is going to support them. But basically, the people now are very, very nervous, of course, what's going to happen to them. And those who come here and have to, or those who want or need to move because they have a partner and have children, for them it's very hard. Of course, some of them try to move into the neighboring countries like Schleswig-Holstein and Niedersachsen. But if you want to find it, you just struggle and you apply and you try to do your very best. And if you can't find anything, then you just stay put and you try to squeeze in to the room you have. And on the other hand, we have, of course, big groups who can afford quite a few square meters. And for that, so basically the square meter per person keeps growing. That's of course. Okay. I think that happens everywhere as well, I'd say.
I think that's a perfect segue to bring Mathias Schulz into the conversation, because I'm certain that much of what you were describing in Hamburg resonates from a Berlin perspective. I think it's fair to say that Berlin has seen rents double on average every decade, right? So there's been a huge upswing in rents, and it's gone from being a city that was described by its governing mayor, Klaus Wowereit, as poor but sexy to a much more expensive place to live than it once was. Mathias Schulz, tell us a little bit about the situation in Berlin.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. The claim poor but sexy is like 10 or 15 years old now, and maybe now Berlin is still sexy, but not poor. And you shouldn't be poor if you want to rent an apartment in the city now. That's a situation you can describe in a short way, but maybe I can introduce in a short notice. So I'm living in Berlin here now since 2001, and in the early 2000s it was very simple. You could so walk down the street and like ripping off a tap for renting flyer, and you get this apartment because it was free. So and nowadays you're seeking for an apartment like a minimum for 6 months to 1 year for finding an affordable apartment. So you have several crises on the same time. It's a renting crisis, and we are not able to build enough new apartments for all the new people who are coming to Berlin now. So it's a double crisis. Nowadays, so what Berlin is doing, and it's quite comparable to Hamburg, and maybe we do a little bit more than Hamburg does, but so first of all, we try to increase building apartments from like state-owned apartments as well as private-owned ones. And nowadays we are running like 6,000 or 7,000 a year, but our aim is now 20,000 per year. For building enough apartments for the persons who need it now. It's not for assuming the need in the future, and that's quite expensive, as you can imagine now, because the prices for buying land and some stuff, it's very they increased as well. What Berlin is doing now, we have a social housing program for subsidy for private investors, that they have to build 30%, sort of like in Hamburg, with social housing, now we are preventing this year 750 million euros per year for subsidy that the private investors are building social apartments as well. So what we're doing on the second way is build apartments by state-owned companies, so that you have a maximum so like influence on the development of the rate interest of the no, sorry, not of the rate interest. So a lot for the yeah, the rental rates. What we're doing on a third level is we're not just looking on new apartments, but you have to look on the increasing rates in the apartments you have now. As you mentioned in the introduction, the rental rates, the increase in the last decade for like 200%, from like €6 to 12, or nowadays for €14 per square meter. Maybe it's quite cheap comparable to the US. I don't know. Maybe you can explain if it's cheap for you, but it's not very cheap for the people who are living in Berlin because of the incomes they can afford. So what we do is like social conservation areas. It's based on federal law, and it gives you the opportunity on a state level to implement social conservation areas. Berlin has now a total number of 71 these social conservation areas, and so it's called Milieuschutzgebiet for special wording, and they're legally established for preserving the composition of the residents in this area. And there's so you can so what you also can do in this area is to you have to prove all your investments in buildings, if it's necessary to invest in your apartment, that you can rent it, or if it's an investment for sort of like luxury investment to change the inhabitants of the apartments. And what you can also do in these areas, you can buy these houses if a private owner wants to sell it to another private owner. You can buy it by state, but you have to keep in mind that there's a jurisdiction from 2021 from the federal court which prohibits this way of buying houses in these areas. So that are all kind of instruments what we are doing in Berlin right now. So there are several instruments on a federal level, so like tenancy law and something like so else what we can talk about maybe later if we want. But maybe it's quite interesting for you to know that Berlin has a very special discussion because of the strength of the renting crisis. Last year, when we had our state elections, there was also a vote for like Volksabstimmung for popular vote on the case of I think about the right word to expropriate private owners who holds more than 3,000 apartments in the city. So it was a really strong discussion, or it is a really strong discussion now, how you can follow this popular vote, or should you follow this popular vote? But it's a sign that the people in Berlin are very anxious about this kind housing market. So how the housing market works for them now. And so it's a very tough discussion that we have in Parliament, and we have with society in Berlin now, how we can solve this renting crisis. So and that's maybe the best example for the deeps of this crisis.
Yeah, Mathias Schulz, thank you so much for that. As somebody who lived in Berlin before the Wende, right? So before the fall of the wall, and then lived in Berlin in the 90s and into the early thousands. I've certainly followed the markets a little bit, and I know that even in the 90s and the early aughts, housing was an issue and was a concern. And if anything, it's only gotten worse since then, as the seat of government has moved from Bonn to Berlin, as Berlin has sort of developed its economy a little bit more. And so there have been a number of pressures that have made Berlin a sought after destination. I'd like to maybe come to this side of the Atlantic now and bring Delegate Holmes into the conversation. We were talking a little bit before we went live, and I pointed out that both Anke Frieling and Mathias Schulz represent city-states, and so they have a sort of unique perspective because they're looking at urban areas and at single cities. Of course, Delegate Holmes, you are in the state of Maryland, and Maryland has some pretty big cities, but it also has some rural areas as well. And I want to get into the urban-rural divide a little bit later, but I thought that you could maybe kick it off by telling us a little bit about the housing situation in Maryland as a whole.
Thank you for this opportunity to be here with all of you on this side of the Atlantic and the other as well. The housing scenario in Maryland, as is across the entire United States, was significantly changed when we had the recession and the housing crisis in 2008, 2009. There were several different parts of legislation that had to be created to help to put a pause on some of the persons that were being removed from their homes because of their inability to afford the mortgages. Lots of federal legislation was passed, and some of it, I think, went a little bit overboard in terms of some of its proposals because of the affordability. Now we're facing a crisis just like everyone else, where it is cheaper on a monthly income to purchase a home rather than to rent. I have occasions where I have represented some people where the rents are almost twice as much as the mortgages would be on a monthly basis. The problem is that some of the persons cannot qualify for these mortgages, and because the qualifications can't be met for a mortgage, they are required to rent. And I have attempted to put in several pieces of legislation to try to rein some of this in. One of the pieces of legislation that I put in right during the 2008-2009 crisis was a land bank, not a bank like where you put your money into, but a land bank, where I allowed a nonprofit to partner with a local government to purchase land, and the nonprofit then could strip off easements and other types of forbearances from the land, and then the nonprofit would take the land and then build upon it for affordable housing units. I made this a statewide piece of legislation. However, only a very few of the local jurisdictions in the state have taken advantage of it, which is, I think, a travesty. But the only thing that I can do is make it available to them. The other issue in terms of why there's so much non-affordable housing is because of the zoning issues. Zoning in Maryland is a responsibility of the local jurisdictions, not of a state representative. So I cannot dictate zoning to the cities or municipalities. The only opportunity that I have is to perhaps be a bully pulpit in terms of what I think zoning should look like. Prior to becoming a representative, I was in fact a civil engineer where I designed housing subdivisions, office parks for a living. And so I had, when I became elected, I have an insight into how the process worked, which was very valuable to me in terms of me attempting to assist local jurisdictions in revising the zoning processes. One of the things we're working on now with some of the jurisdictions is to allow persons who have, for example, a detached garage on a single family home to be able to allow that detached garage to be converted into a livable facility, maybe a one bedroom or a studio efficiency type of unit. This type of scenario would not require any additional water and sewer connections because the sewer and water connections are already there. Traffic would not necessarily be increased because in these types of studio arrangements, it would be for most cases a single person or an elderly person. So we wouldn't have to be too much concerned about impact on traffic and or impact on the school student ratios being increased as well. We are also facing now in Maryland the influx of investors coming in, and having investors willing to participate in the purchase and construction is a good thing, except that sometimes the investors have a different scenario in mind in terms of why they are there for the housing scenarios. Their interest, rightfully so, is for their board members of their investors, which makes sense, and I understand that totally. But I think we need to have an adjustment or a scenario where some of the persons who are assisting in the developers in obtaining this land for apartment complex can have a scenario for different types of zoning to allow for affordable housing. I heard one of the panelists talk about accessible zoning in having a portion of the apartments for affordable housing. Some of the jurisdictions in the state of Maryland don't allow that. 30% of housing being set aside for affordable is allowed in some jurisdictions in the state, but not all. And what that does is it pushes affordable housing more to one jurisdiction as opposed to the other. And that's where we run into the not in my backyard scenario for some of the persons who live in the state. As we continue our discussions, we can kind of dig into some of the other aspects of it, but I'll leave it here at this moment so we can delve into some of the other issues of concern to those here on the discussion.
Delegate Holmes, you mentioned that there were single-family homes on some of these sites, on some of these locations in Maryland. And one of our viewers just sent a note in saying that on the city development, the Stadtentwicklung of Berlin, it lists that 54% of Berlin households are single-person households. And so I'm curious if you have a similar number for Maryland of single-person households. And then I want to bring Mathias Schulz and Anke Frieling back into the conversation to see whether there are any changes in thinking about social attitudes toward single-person households.
Yes, there are. I don't have a number for single person households, except that what I can say is that most of the land development and the housing construction is for single family, single house living, like a single family home or a townhouse or a condominium. And in those scenarios, the cost of the housing, as indicated earlier, is significantly higher than what can be afforded in some of the mortgage applications. Rentals now are creeping up to over 50% of their monthly income. And when you get to the 50% scenario of the income, you don't qualify in most cases for a mortgage, and that significantly makes things a little bit more difficult. Now, across the state, we have farmland, and in those farmland areas, in most cases, there is no public water and sewer, it's well and septic. In the well and septic scenarios, that offers additional challenges to constructing additional units because of the septic requirements. And we all know water is, because of climate change, water wells are in some areas declining in their depth, which means digging wells deeper and deeper is a requirement. Mm-hmm. And so it's a varied scenario all across the state.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mathias Schulz, Anke Frieling, can you talk a little bit about this issue from the perspective of each of your cities? The single household question.
I thought about it, some numbers that I can tell you. So it's true that 50% of the apartments who are rented in Berlin are they're living single households in it. It's quite 50%. And in case of like the last mentioned before of single family houses, I'm not really sure, but it's like up to 10% of all the housing in Berlin. So we have 1.9 million apartments around about, and 170,000 single family buildings in Berlin. So, but our policy is not to designate new building areas for single family households because of less space in the city. So Berlin is growing, and we have to use the space what is lasting now for building higher houses and more family households. So in Berlin is typical way of building houses is up to 6 floors, and now we are discussing of building higher living houses in Berlin.
Mm-hmm.
But
so those would be apartment buildings.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So, but usually we are building apartment houses who are not higher than 6 levels, and we are now discussing, okay, there's not enough space for building just 6-floor buildings in the city for like 20,000 apartments per year. So we have to get higher, but we are discussing how high it should be in a city like Berlin.
And is this a similar situation in Hamburg?
Basically, yes. We also have a large number of single-person households, like also more than 50%. But usually, as I said before, they have the apartments they live in are often quite big. And if you look at certain areas, especially the attractive areas downtown, these are areas where formerly in these apartments lived like a family with 3, even 4 children back in the 70s, and today it's just one person who lives there. So many people lose and need or have a lot more space than they used to have it. We also have this debate, of course, with the single family homes, because if you look at what people want, especially once they have a partner and have children, they all want to live in single family houses. So there's still demand, and we had at least especially the Green Party here in Hamburg said no more houses that type, and we want to have like the multi-family houses or and apartment blocks and so on and so forth. But this debate is still ongoing, and I think it will in certain parts of the cities will probably keep that areas. I think they're like whatever Dahlem in Berlin, and we do have similar parts here. And then at least for, as I can say it for the CDU, but we're not we're not in power right now. But we say we don't want any further ceiling. So what we have to do is actually the same what Mathias Schulz just said. We need to build higher. But I mean, building higher sounds very plausible, and looking at it, you'd say, yeah, that's right. If you don't want to seal, so you just go up, you build higher, but then talk to the neighbors. And then you have a lot of resistance. And I think that it's going to be hard work, but I think that's the only way to go, because we don't want to use additional land that we have. I mean, especially as city states, you know, we don't have endless agricultural land, and that we might even be able to use. But even in that areas, I think the basic question is, in terms of climate change and reaching our CO2 goals, we can't do it any longer. So we have to go up, and we have to actually use more efficiently what we sealed already. And I think Berlin has the same situation in many parts, like we have the big roads. And after the war, we started building, and the houses were quite small, and so there's still a lot of potential in using that space better, and that's what Hamburg tries to do. But of course, the plots of these houses are actually owned by different people. So in terms of starting a larger development, it takes quite some time, because you have to find an investor. He has to get hold of these pieces of land, and then you can start the actual planning and building process. Mm-hmm. But I think that's the way to go.
We've started to get into this, in this conversation, and you, Frau Frieling, you just raised a couple of these points, but I'd like to maybe spend a couple of minutes talking about the causes of the housing shortage and the affordable housing crisis that we're seeing in Germany and in the United States. Is it fair to say that this is just due to not enough supply? Are there other factors at play in this? And Delegate Holmes, since you unmuted yourself, I'd like to ask specifically also about whether the affordable housing issue is also an issue of racial equity and fair housing, and not just a space issue, right? I mean, race plays a role in all of this as well.
You are correct. One of the primary reasons for the crisis in affordable housing is, in fact, as I indicated at the top, zoning. We have had a view on having land zoning primarily for the use of single-family homes for a very, very long time here in the state of Maryland, and it is still taking a lot of time to change persons' minds on that. When we start talking about increasing the density, then some people's minds start turning to, we don't want those particular persons in our neighborhoods. And when you start talking in language like that, it sometimes can be reduced to a racial scenario. But when you start to look at, in quotes, those people, it is just persons that have less available income, which does not specifically apply to any particular race or gender. It's just those that are now being priced out. And what some are finding is that once we open up the doors to allow affordable housing, it is not those in one particular race or the other that are making the applications. It is everyone making the applications to try to get into those affordable units, because there is such a need for it across the entire state. But it's difficult to change persons' minds. And it's like I said earlier about the NIMBY, not in my backyard. Even in scenarios where you have one particular ethnicity and you start asking persons to allow affordable housing, even within that ethnicity, they start declining their wishes to have affordable housing for fear of persons with requiring affordable housing, that their values may be of a different type, lower value in some cases, these scenarios. But as time goes on, we are beginning to find that people's minds are changing. However, it is a slow process. And the only thing that we can do as elected officials is to keep hammering and hammering and hammering until once people see that affordable housing is not necessarily a bad thing. It's a way to get persons to get a leg up and to become more self-sustainable, like the larger population.
Thank you. Matthias Schulz and Anke Frieling, there have been some studies on Germany as well that have shown that people of color face greater challenges when it comes to finding affordable housing. And it would be interesting to hear how this has been addressed in each of your states, particularly in light of something that's already come up in our conversation today, the influx of migrants and refugees beginning in 2015, but then of course, more recently because of the war in Ukraine, and how that has upset the housing market as well. I don't know who might want to go first with that.
Should I start this time?
Sure.
Okay. I mean, as you were just saying, Mr. Holmes, I mean, the competition for affordable housing, of course, increases, I'd say, bad feelings amongst the groups or the people competing for these houses, of course. We have envy, we have hostility. And as you said, of course, I say of course, but yeah, I'm sorry. I think it unfortunately, it is of course that if you have a foreign last name, it is harder for you to. I don't think there's no easy solution. Can you still hear me? Because it says
you cut out for a second, but you're back now.
Okay, good. Because I mean, there's not enough supply, and it's not going to change quickly. So yes, there's of course support offered in terms of money and also in finding a place, but it's becoming more and more difficult. And so the city of Hamburg has done, like you were talking about the social preservation regulations areas. We do have them here in Hamburg as well. So we're trying to keep the prices low in that area by not allowing many transactions. But it's also making it harder, for example, in terms of renovation and in terms of all the things you want to do to use less heating and so on and so forth. So there are certain built-in contradictions which also limit these areas. But I think, as I said before, I don't think there's any quick solution to that part. Everybody's now hoping for subsidies to at least to support people during the energy crisis, so that they can at least pay their homes. In Hamburg, we're also talking about, we do have quite a few like state-owned apartments and places, and at least those we encourage to keep them there, so that they don't have to move out, even if they cannot pay their rent. But as I'll leave it here.
No, thank you. That's very helpful.
And if I could piggyback before you go to Mr. Schulz, on one of those statements that were just previously made, we have toyed with the idea of removing an applicant's last name and just putting some other type of identifier on the applicant to remove the last name, so that the discriminatory practices that some are utilizing would be eliminated. We haven't completed that type of legislation yet, because we're working through how that process can go can continue with the credit union identification process and the criminal investigation background process. But that's one of the things that we have been looking at.
Marvin Holmes, that's very helpful, because actually one of our viewers was curious to know what action is being taken at the state level to try to overcome some of the discriminatory practices of landlords. And obviously that's one of the measures that can be taken. Mathias Schulz, do you have anything to add to this topic?
Yeah, maybe a few sentences. So so against the background of the affordable rent crisis, so the pressure on the Berlin housing market, of course, can be observed that the problem of discrimination in the search for housing is also increasing, of course, even in Berlin. And in this context, our State Office for Equal Treatment Against Discrimination has commissioned and like it's called Urban Plus Office to prepare a study on intervention options against discrimination on the housing market, and the report, as well as so the actors from anti-discrimination networks, from tenant associations, and so on. They have confirmed there's a special need for intervention, and it's so we called a new office. It's and a new paper. It's called Mission Statement Berlin's Rent is Fairly, subtitled, and they're calling some aims to motivate the variety of landlords to apply for to allocate and rent managed housing in a way that's free of discrimination. So it's like to raise the last name, of course. It's an opinion, but also to regulate the housing market, yeah, to give the people the right to regulate that there has to be some space for people who are having no money or low income and so on. So that the sheet of paper is with several measures you can implement, and you can try to implement in a state, but it depends on regulation, but also on a free commitment of landlords that you should have as well. So because the possibility of regulation on a state level, it shrinks compared to the federal level.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I have lots more questions and a number of other sort of topics I'd like to bring up, but I also want to remind our viewers that if you have a question, you can use the raise your hand function or post your question to the chat, and we'll bring you into the conversation. And maybe while people are thinking about questions, I'd like to ask each of you, maybe very briefly, what sort of an impact the COVID-19 pandemic has had on housing in each of your states, whether it's exacerbated the situation or whether there are any maybe positive lessons we can take from the last 2 to 2.5 years that can help when thinking about how to address some of the housing challenges. Marvin Holmes, your mic is hot, so I'll let you sort of take a first whack at that question.
Sure. The COVID pandemic has caused additional scenarios and problems in every aspect of life. And housing is not immune from having had additional problems in it. The one thing that I can say that has been a positive, if you can use it in that aspect of this pandemic, is how we are viewing ourselves today. Zoom. Previous to the pandemic, we were not using this type of function as well as we should. Now we're across the Atlantic and we're having discussions like this. What we are encouraging is what we are doing in terms of legislation. We are revising the laws in how persons can communicate with each other utilizing this video conference scenario. There are, for example, in the common ownership communities that we have here in the United States, homeowners associations, condo associations. Previous to the pandemic, there were no established laws in how the boards of directors were allowed to communicate with each other. And because I'm chair of the housing and real estate in the state, I've been very, very instrumental in allowing this type of meeting process. One other thing I want to talk about very, very briefly in terms of affordable housing, sometimes when large owners of apartment complexes find that their tenants are falling behind in rent, they go to the court system, and immediately upon the 5th or 6th of every month, because rents are due on the 1st, after the 5th of the month, the grace period terminates, and then the landlord can file eviction processes. One of the things that we have done in Maryland is that we are pushing legislation that says even if the landlord files a court case, the landlord-tenant court for eviction, if the tenant cures within an appropriate amount of time, then that filing of eviction does not go onto the tenant's record. Because when a tenant has a record of being filed against by the landlord, it makes it more difficult for them to get additional rental properties. But if they cure, meaning they pay that landlord that money, then we are attempting to have that cured landlord-tenant case removed from the tenant's record, so they can move forward and get additional rentals easier later.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mathias Schulz and Anke Frieling, what sort of an impact did the pandemic have in Berlin and Hamburg, respectively, on housing? And are there any lessons that one can take away from the last couple of years?
Oh, that's a very big question. I think because the Corona pandemic told us several lessons in case of housing, social housing, and especially on urban development in general. So I think lots of countries were in the phase of the development during the Corona crisis. So they were looking for ways to dampen the impact on the Corona crisis, and I think for protections were mostly being used, like termination protection for tenants, like mortgage release, and the rent freezes, or like rent subsidies for personal subsidy on to afford your rent, and for paying your rent to not get kicked out of your apartment. So, and it was I think a Corona pandemic, even so also in a case of housing rents, were total lesson that state regulation is possible, and even a strong regulation of how rental interest rates could rise or not rise, and how a new definition maybe of social duties from house owners. Maybe so that kind of lesson what we learned maybe all over the world, and especially I learned during the Corona pandemic. And the second big lesson was the importance of free space around your house, of open places, of parks, of green facilities, of social facilities you need for a good life and for well-being, even in a very in an urban area. So most of the people had to stay home, so they are living in small flats. Maybe if they have a big family and they can't afford a better apartment, they are living in two-room apartments with 4 or 5 persons, and then the need for free places, for parks, and for public spaces is so highly recommended that you have to prepare in discussion on further developments, that you have to leave the space a good way of living and for a social way of living, and especially in big cities like Berlin, like Hamburg, or like in the US. That's two big lessons for me.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Frau Frieling.
I think in Hamburg, what we first saw in the beginning, and as maybe first 2 years, was actually lots of people considering moving to the outskirts of Hamburg. And at some point, we started believing that could be a trend. So it's being investigated now. We initiated a study to find out, is it a trend? Is it sustainable? Is it something that we're going to observe over the next couple of years? Because working from home is easier. So you don't have to drive into town every day. Overall in Germany, I think we're coming to this three days work, 2 days home. On average, I'd say. There are, of course, lots and lots of exceptions, but as a rule of thumb, you'd say that. So it would be possible to live outside of Hamburg and find maybe a house with a garden, which is really hard to find in Hamburg, and basically for most people not affordable. Although, if we look at the prices of housing, and that's something we haven't talked about because it's also something we couldn't influence in the past, and we're not going to influence in the future. Is, of course, there were macroeconomic factors that also, of course, made property very expensive, because it was like an investment case. It was a good way to invest money into property, but better than other ways. So this situation has changed. We already see prices coming down, not tremendously coming down, but at least they are not rising.
Yeah.
And so, but none of us knows whether this is going to go on or not. And so first, is this a trend? Are people leaving cities? Yes, but I don't think big time. So it will be a couple of people, but not big time. The actual situation, I think that it was horrible for many families. It was horrible for many families who live in small apartments, and but it was also horrible for people living alone, because they couldn't go to work. They were just by themselves. And I think even now you see a lot more people who are really a little lost, just to say it in a nice way. People with depression and so on and so forth. I think it's not good for people to spend too much time by themselves. So we also, in terms of, new construction sites, new building areas, I think community space has become a lot more important and much higher on the agenda than it has in the past. But of course, it's another thing that makes construction and building more expensive. Yep. And I think for Germany, one very important thing is actually we have to find a way to build simpler and cheaper. And we have to actually check our building regulations, and maybe in some parts and points have to say, okay, we have to go do it differently. Because if you look at the Netherlands, and they have the very same problems, but they build simpler and they also build faster.
Yeah, we've seen similar phenomena in the United States to what you're describing in Hamburg, in terms of people wanting to move out into the suburbs, in terms of the impact on people who live in small apartments and those who are living alone. And obviously there are a number of issues that need to be addressed there. I'd like to bring one of our viewers into the conversation. Quanta Dawn Light has her hand raised, and so I'm asking her to unmute her mic and pose her question.
Thank you very much. You were asking about how things are in our areas where we live. I think there is an internal migration due to climate change as well. Like, I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, and we have an influx of people. It used to be 3-4 years ago 60 persons per day, but now it's a lot higher, coming from south, north, as well as west of United States, because this is a temperate zone. And I think we have a perfect storm in terms of inflation, in terms of the shortages of housing. Just yesterday in the news, they had given people who were in subsidized housing, I think they were in hotels, and they've been giving eviction notices. So I think we have economic, climate change, and also we have international refugees coming. So, and my own home has doubled in value in 5 years. And not that I had made any changes. So I wonder if we sometimes look at it in a fragmented way rather than look at the interconnections in a matrix. It's just not one thing alone, but there's so many things that's causing the housing problem in the urban areas. Thank you very much.
No, I mean, I think those are great observations. Again, Marvin Holmes, you unmuted your mic, so I assume that you have a bit of a response to that.
It is very interesting that the person on the line talked about Charlotte. I had a couple of persons within the Maryland General Assembly who are now actually thinking about moving from Maryland to the North Carolina area, because there's now, as indicated by another panelist, that there's no necessity any longer to go into an office. You can work from just about anywhere. And North Carolina seems to be a very attractive, North Carolina and South Carolina seem to be a very, very attractive place where persons are really looking at nowadays. And one of the other things that is attracting persons to that particular region, as indicated by the caller, is the tax structure differential between one state and the other. And the tax structure in, I hate to admit this, tax structure in North Carolina and South Carolina is probably more attractive to those who are retiring than is in the current state that I live in. And that's why persons are looking at those areas. So the income and holding on to your cash is a very real, what people are looking for in terms of their desired location to live.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. While we wait and see if there's another question from our viewers, one thing that we haven't really talked about is the transportation infrastructure and sort of the role that transportation plays or might play in having affordable housing. And Mathias Schulz, you were just nodding your head when I brought up transportation. I'd love to hear maybe in just a sentence or two from each of you your thoughts on the role that transportation plays in this. I mean, theoretically, people can live a little bit further away from their jobs, particularly as Anke Frieling was saying, if they're not coming in to the office or to their workplace every day. How is that changing the landscape? Mathias Schulz, maybe you can go first, and then Anke Frieling, and then we'll come to Marvin Holmes.
Yeah, that's it's an interesting question, because I'm also a member of the mobility people of my for the SPD, and so that's, of course, we are talking and we are facing some big struggles, because in the metropolitan region of Berlin, they're living now like 4.5 million people, so something like that. And like, I think 500,000 commuters per day are going to Berlin, and they're moving on later on out. So there's a big need for a strong public transport system for connecting the urban areas and the suburban areas and the other maybe smaller cities who are surrounding Berlin, and that's a big issue. And so on one point, and you have to keep in mind that you have to build a strong public transport system, because otherwise everybody wants to go by his own car to the city center to go to work and to entering the place where he has to do the things that they have to do. And it's very strict that all these pollution, which is caused by private transport, by driving cars and so on, they mostly affect people who are living in the cheaper apartments who are located on big streets. So cheapest apartments are there. This kind of apartments who are located on big streets, so near the airports, and all these transport systems who have a high rate of pollution, and it's really noisy, and that's of course a social issue to organize so most pieces of transport and public transport, that you have big transports like subway, like regional trains, and so on, to decrease the pollution and to decrease the noise for all people who are living within the cities and who want to get into the city and outside.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Frau Frieling, anything to add?
On mobility, I mean, yes, of course, we don't want people driving their cars into town, especially not in Hamburg, as we're divided by quite a large river, and we don't have that many bridges or subterranean highways. So we're kind of limited in that regard. But I mean, if you look at the situation and you look at living in, the suburban areas, as soon as you have good public transport, as soon as you have regular trains like the S-Bahn and so on, prices go up immensely. So it's less. So if you want to really achieve lower prices in a greater area, you need to kind of build more train connections, and that's, I mean, that's what most cities are working on, from my understanding. I think Berlin does it, we do it, Munich does it. I think that is the thing to do. It's also not, but it's not quickly done. So for quite some time, people will still use their cars, and we as cities have to make sure that they still can get into the city and through the city. And we cannot just say, okay, we're kind of reducing the width of our roads, and then then it's your problem if you can't get through.
These transitions obviously take time.
Yes, they do. But of course you can do, and you can go differently about it. I mean, you can be really restrictive and try to get all cars out. And right now we have a government that tries a little bit to go that way, but what it creates is a lot of hostility on the roads. So but it's not easily done. But definitely this is the aspect. If you as soon as the public transport system around you is very good, the prices will go up.
Here in our area, I indicated earlier that zoning is not constitutionally allowed by those who represent states. It is a local issue. However, I proposed legislation within the Maryland General Assembly, knowing full well that it was not constitutional, that required local zoning to build housing around the train stations within Maryland. Now, I knew that the bill would not gather muster in the legal scenario, but I was just trying to make a point. And once the local jurisdictions recognized that I was stepping on their toes, the ire of them coming after me it began to inspire them to push some zoning around local transportation, mass transit stations, to the point where if you are allowing housing infrastructure around the train stations, there are some incentives that are being allowed around those train stations. I think their ire has dissipated over the years, because once you try to do something that's right, they recognize that you're only trying to do something that's right. We also have revised some of the state requirements on what we call P3 construction, public-private partnerships. P3, public, public-private partnerships. And what we have done is allowed the construction, permitting, and design process to be done concurrently, as opposed to in a stepped level, which allows the developers, the owners of the investments to move faster. As indicated, my earlier life, I was a civil engineer and I designed projects. So I used to have meetings with my staff indicating how much money we're losing per day if we don't get a permit. And those are the things that investors look at. And the P3 process that the state of Maryland has allowed is beginning to allow some of these construction processes to move a little bit faster. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm looking to see if there are any hands raised. There was one, but it's been taken down in the meantime. So let me maybe start to wrap things up with a final question to each of you. And I have one for you, Marvin Holmes, about the US, and then one for our two German guests. Delegate Holmes, obviously, we've seen a real change in mortgage rates here in the US. They are going up at an incredible rate. And I'm wondering what sort of an impact you think that will have on the affordable housing market in the mid to the long term.
It's a tremendous impact because those that were looking to purchase now cannot afford to purchase. And so now because they cannot afford to purchase, now they're being pushed into the rental market. And because so many people are being pushed into the rental market, rental rates are increasing tremendously. I just got a call last week from a over 55 community apartment complex. They are protesting in the streets because these are retired individuals in apartment complex. Their rents have gone up $200 per month, and they have within 30 days to sign a new lease. I've got newspapers and TV people coming out to talk to the apartment managers to see what it is that we can do to try to keep these rents not going up that much so quickly. The problem that we're going to have, however, is that, and I've seen this in the past, as soon as apartment owners see such a resistance in increasing the rental rates to a market rate, those owners of the apartment complex will then throw their hands up, and then they will turn those apartments into condominiums. Instead of rentals, now they become ownership. So I'm trying to walk a fine line with the owners of the apartment complex and to help these older adults, but we can't push too hard because they'll take the apartments away. They will no longer be rentals. They now will be turned into condominium ownership.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So now going across the Atlantic to Germany, in last year's federal election, affordable housing was a topic. It was a subject that came up in a couple of the debates between the various candidates, and the new government that came in December made a pledge to build more than 400,000 new housing units. And I'm curious to hear from each of you, representing both sides of the political spectrum, if you will, from the Christian Democrat to the Social Democrat, what the likelihood is that this goal of building more housing units will be achieved in light of the fact that Germany is facing a severe energy crisis, and we have the war in Ukraine, which is also sort of taking attention away from some of the very important domestic issues that need to be addressed. Anke Frieling, you have your mic on, so why don't you respond first?
I think actually in terms of supply chain issues and rising cost of building, even before the war in Ukraine started, I don't think the goals we won't reach those goals. You see a tremendous slowdown here in Hamburg, tremendous. You can talk to the big developers, but even if you talk to the smaller ones, if you talk to we have these oh, is it called Genossenschaften, when like you cooperate as a group of people, and they can't afford it anymore because it's unpredictable when you will get the material, but it's also the cost of material has gone up tremendously. So people decide, okay, we're going to wait and see how things work out. And so this is not the end of the world, because eventually they will start building again. But for the next 1 or 2 years, I think they will be very, very cautious, and nothing much is going to happen. And if you look at Hamburg, for example, if in terms of affordable housing, how many units have been built until in the first half year? 19. 19. And the goal for the year is more than 2,000. And the senator who's responsible, she keeps saying, yes, it's going to come in the second half of 2022, but it's not going to happen. It didn't happen last year, by the way. They didn't reach their goal, but they didn't, fell short that much. But this year, it's not going to happen. How could it?
Yeah.
Everybody's extremely cautious.
Yeah, that makes sense. Mathias Schulz, the last word goes to you in Berlin. Any different thoughts on this perspective or on this issue of the housing stock and building new housing units as a priority of this federal government?
Not really a different perspective. So of course, the supply chain problematic, and to get a building material, like the interest rates, that all prices are increasing now in a way we couldn't imagine, so like half a year before. And it's in a situation now not possible to subsidize everything with public money. It's so the money is so I think Germany is a rich state, and Hamburg is as well, Berlin, as I mentioned in my first sentence as well. Yeah, so there is public money, but it's but we need maybe some money for subsidize all the energy crisis for the people, and not to put everything in the building sector. So there are several problems you have to fix now, and the money ends sometimes. Then it's like it is. So, but I'm hopeful that we get a better situation next year. But I think for this year, I'm not very I don't look very on a bright side to rise up even the permits and especially on starting building new houses in Berlin. Even the public-owned building companies are thinking about stop beginning new building projects. So it's a very severe crisis of building. What's going on? It's not maybe it's not a special German problem. It's like a problem like all over Europe. Yeah. But we have to promise to build these apartments, because we do need them in all over Germany, because affordable housing is a problem, but it's still existing. So we have to achieve all our strong and all our the free money that we can have to move on this issue. And I don't want to start a discussion about to rise taxes and so on, but there's not the right point now. But of course, if you're shrinked by money, you have to look how you can get it on other ways. And it's clear you can't solve all these problems with the supply chain by money. So you have to wait until it's going better, and to work and to fix all these supply chain issues. But building new houses shouldn't be a problem in money. So yeah, it can't be a problem in money.
Well, I want to thank all three of you for this fascinating discussion that we've had today. I found it to be truly interesting, and it underscores once again how even if there are different nuances in both of our countries, and indeed from community to community, there are definitely some common challenges, maybe even universal problems that we have in common in both places. And it's extremely helpful to talk with each other about how we can try to develop solutions and try to understand how some similar problems have been addressed in other places. We did not spend a lot of time talking about possible policy recommendations, and maybe that's something that we can do another time, but I come away with this with a lot of interesting new ideas and a deeper understanding of some of the challenges faced at the local level and how the state level is trying to address that. In all of these cases, though, we've seen and we've heard it will take a lot of time to really come up with good solutions and implement them. But on behalf of the Aspen Institute in Germany and the American Council on Germany, I really want to thank all three of you for this lively, this engaging conversation, and perhaps even more importantly, for the work that you do every day to try to address these issues. One final note, though, to our viewers is I want to put out a save the date for November 30th, when we will be talking about agriculture and food security with a group of legislators as well. And so for now, thank you for joining us to everybody. I wish you a good day here in the United States, and schöne Feierabend to our friends in Germany.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. See you.